Part 1 to 5. Who are they crying for? Luke 23, 27 to 28 says. 27 A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. 28 Jesus turned and said to them, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. Through the eyes of man, the Lord's painful journey with the heavy cross on his shoulder would have been a sight more terrible than any other. The women and all that followed him shed tears of sorrow. Jesus understood the piercing hearts of the women who wept for him that day. But he could not only see the meaning of their tears with the eyes of a man. It is only with the eyes of eternity that you may truly interpret the situation. If we use human emotion and compassion alone to judge our situations, we cannot escape from the mindset of this world. And if we evaluate everything within the limits of this world, faith is meaningless to us. The women simply shed tears because of what happened before their eyes. But to Jesus it was yet another successful step to fulfill his mission and purpose on earth, and thus beyond that time of suffering, and beyond their tears. He could see the glory shining in heaven, and saw that a storm of misfortune was awaiting those who had forsaken the truth. But those that simply pitied Jesus were not able to see this terror that would come upon them very soon. And at that very moment, the Lord knew that the day of destruction was coming to Jerusalem where the Messiah was crucified. See the words of 23:31. 31 For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? This emphasizes the view of the great destruction Jerusalem would face as God's judgment for rejecting the true Messiah. So, the preceding words, "Weep for your children," was a warning of Jesus to prepare for the terrible destruction of Jerusalem. And he declares of when the land would not be able to escape this fire of judgment by the comparison, it is easy for a fire to catch on a dry tree than on a green one. Of course, the dry tree here is Jerusalem, where the glory of God was absent and the people indulged in their own glory, ignoring the true purpose of their creation and thus bringing forth the wrath of God. What is important is not that we live as religious people. Mere religious acts do not make us true Christians. And the beautiful buildings, decorations, and worship ordinances that please the eye are not what Christianity is all about. Indeed, these are needed as well, but with such fancy packaging, there is a great risk of missing the fact that there is much more to what is inside. That is why we must place the inner content as our focus, not the packaging. And we need to see if it sincerely makes God happy. In order to avoid future regret and lamentation, we must deeply consider what to think, what to say, what to do, and what to teach. As I listened to the man speak, it was as if my inner self had been asleep and by the piercing truth of his words, had just been awakened and was rubbing its eyes. The grace I had received was so overwhelming that I had to keep myself from trembling. It was not my obligation to translate his words to the Koreans in the service that led me to pay attention to him. I had been going through a time of spiritual hollowness myself, and my heart was craving for grace to pour down on me like rain on a desert. It did not take me another second to realize that this was God's answer to my prayers. I had forgotten the days when I served the Lord with great health and enthusiasm and was having cowardly thoughts to return to Korea just because I lacked economic support. But when my terribly starved soul met a great source of nutrition, it was as if my dead cells started to come alive. So after that day, I would call him Blind Jesus. The words that poured out of his lips seemed to resemble Jesus, who had confidently shouted in front of the Pharisees. His words were piercing, just as Jesus' words were when he said, "What you believe and say that is right is just an empty shell and lousy packaging, and what I say now is the truth, so sharpen your ears and listen carefully." I believe the blind young man was an angel sent by God in this perfect timing to give strength to a soul exhausted from ministry work. He continued, The situation we are in is not a problem at all. And the daily uncomfortable and difficult conditions we face have no impact on our failure and success. The only question is if we have enough spiritual strength to overcome it all. It is about whether we are asking God to help us judge the difficult situations we face with spiritual eyes and to overcome them by faith. I had no choice but to call this man the blind Jesus. His words had reminded me of a certain event that happened in my ministry. It was one day during my ministry when I was working with the most power and enthusiasm. And it was in this moment that I was able to confirm the fact that God was with me the whole time in the ministry field. It was a moment when I was given so much strength that it seemed like there was no difficulty that I could not get through. And the things that the man said had reminded me of that very moment, recharging me with the same strength I had received then. The Lord was uplifting my spirit through His servant once more. For that reason, at least I had no doubt about the fact that Jesus was the appearance of the young man as a blind man. This important memory was when I was at a prison where I worked for a few years. Continue in part 1 to 6.